Hi there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet. Because that's what I am. I'm a puppy sensei and I make Japanese content to help you level up your abilities. So last week I didn't put out a grammar drop video. I had a lot of personal stuff come up and I really just couldn't get everything done in time. I think I really needed a bit of a break. But that's not actually really like me. By which I mean, generally speaking, I do tend to stay at least current enough that I usually get all of my videos out on schedule. So, for today, we're going to be looking at a phrase that exemplifies this idea of, that's so much like so-and-so. In Japanese, there's this handy suffix, poi, that can mean something like, that's to be expected of a certain person or a certain type of thing. We could easily define poi as something like the English word esque, as in picturesque, like a picture, statuesque, like a statue, Kafkaesque, like a Kafka. So here's poi. This is the first thing that I want you to note about poi. See that small tsu? This isn't common for affixes in Japanese. But in all cases when you use poi to describe something, you're going to be forced to put that small gem in it, a small stop, between the thing that you're describing and this suffix. For today, we're going to learn 3 different environments in which you'll see this poi structure. And we'll talk about how you use it, and we'll also talk about the very slightly nuanced changes in meaning that poi can have across different environments. We've seen other suffixes before in Japanese that follow a very similar pattern to poi, like we're seeing here. So poi is going to follow the stem of some verbs, and the stem is the mas form minus mas. It's going to be able to follow any noun within reason. It does kind of have to make sense in context. And then it can also follow the stem of any e adjective. Basically, the stem is just when you drop the e. And like I said, this is actually fairly common in terms of Japanese grammar. This is kind of a structure that we've seen before. Things that follow the stem and a noun and an e adjective without the e. So in practice, here's what that looks like. So I'm showing here an ichidan verb, wasureru, ne, and that's going to become wasureppoi. We have a godan verb, that's okoru, and okoru would become okorippoi. A noun like nihonjin would become nihonjinppoi, right? That's very emblematic of a Japanese person. That's so like a Japanese person, something like that. And then an adjective, yasui, would become yasuppoi. Remember to drop the e. We're going to talk in a bit about what phrases like these specifically mean, but for the moment, I mostly just want you to see how poi attaches to each of these different parts of speech. Because it's really an emblematic use for the poi grammatical pattern, we're going to start by talking about nouns. That's kind of the most common use of poi, so that's where we're going to begin. Alright, so we're going to look at this nihonjin poi, ne? Something like that. When we use poi as a suffix with a noun, we're saying that something is particularly like that noun. It creates a situation that claims some noun has the extremely notable qualities of some other noun. Let's look at an example. Puppy-sensei wa tokidoki kodomo ppoi desu. Look, there's nothing wrong with being a little bit in touch with your inner child, okay? So this sentence means something like, Puppy-sensei can be a little bit childish. Puppy-sensei is occasionally a little bit childish, something like that. But what I want to draw your attention to here is this. Generally speaking, with these sentences that use the poi grammar pattern, we're most often going to see some noun being juxtaposed with some other noun. So here our nouns are Puppy-sensei, it me, and kodomo, child. Shut up, baga. Anyway, the point in this case is that in the environment where we're creating kind of a situation like this, the primary noun in the sentence is being compared to some other noun, right? There has to be some kind of connection, and you're creating a comparison. And it's said to exhibit some quality that is maybe reminiscent of that second noun. You're going to see here that you don't have to provide any kind of justification for this. Like, there's nothing in the sentence that explains why the claim is made. It's not Puppy-sensei sometimes acts in a childish way because she's really silly. Instead, it's kind of just stated as a simple fact, right? It's just these two things and we're connecting them together. So you don't necessarily have to give any kind of reasoning behind your claim. However, I'd like to look at another example. お寿司は日本っぽいです. This sentence is, well, it's wrong. And that's interesting because all the parts of the sentence actually make good sense. 日本っぽい implies that something has a certain Japanese quality. And that's, of course, true of sushi, isn't it? Sushi is a native Japanese food. So why does this sentence suck? Because sushi isn't 日本っぽい. Sushi is a Japanese food. Generally speaking, when we use the poi suffix, we kind of need to be comparing two nouns that are unexpectedly alike. They are things that you don't ordinarily think of as being related, and yet, despite surface level opinions, the noun in question exhibits the surprising quality of being like the second noun. One time, I remember a Japanese guy telling me that I was very Nihonjin-poi, ne? And I recall being really happy and thanking him for comparing me to a Japanese-type person, right? He thought that my manner of speaking and that my way of thinking about the world were very Japanese, and he told me so, and I thought that that was a compliment. But he looked at me very, very confused, and he told me that he did not mean it as a compliment, because for him, he thought it was weird that I, a non-Japanese woman, acted in a way that reminded him so much of his Japanese contemporaries. I guess I don't really make a very good, loud American girl. Anyway, this is the reason that Puppy-sensei wa tokidoki chotto kodomoっぽい works, but osushi wa nihonっぽい does not work. Because I am a teacher, and I'm supposed to be all professional and businesslike and serious, and yet I do things like call my manager a baga, ne? But the sushi wa nihonっぽい doesn't work because sushi can't be Japanese-like. It's just Japanese. Sushi is a Japanese food, right? You can see why these things don't really connect. It doesn't work because, of course, sushi is Japanese. It can't be like a Japanese thing because it is a Japanese thing. All right, let's shift gears very slightly and talk about e-adjectives. With e-adjectives, we're going to see a very similar use of poi. So here's an example sentence. この映画は怖っぽいだけど、実は怖くない. I want to break this down for you very carefully so we fully understand all the nuance here. この映画, this movie. Whatever movie we might be talking about. Maybe we're already having a conversation and somebody brought up some movie. 怖っぽい exhibits the quality of being scary. Here I've translated it as seems scary, but I really think of poi with an adjective as creating some kind of contrast, right? You look at the movie and you think that it should be scary. Maybe the poster looks in some way that you're thinking, oh, that looks scary. However, based on that contrast, there's the expectation of something being one way. However, it's actually not. So the rest of the sentence, dakedo, here means however. This movie seems scary, but jitsu wa means in reality, in truth. Kowakunai is not scary. It looks scary, but it's not. So we're setting up an expectation that the primary noun could be like the secondary noun, and yet it isn't. So I'd like to look at the inverse case. これは怖くない映画だった。怖っぽいです. Basically, this is the reverse. a movie that isn't supposed to be scary, a kawakunai eiga, a not scary movie, and yet the payoff is that it actually seems to be a scary movie. Kawappoi, ne? These are fairly common use cases for poi when used with an e adjective. I expect something to be one way, but it's actually another way. And really, that's similar to our noun example, right? It's setting up a distinction between the way something seems to be and its actual quality, right? We really need to be able to set up, I expect this to be like this, but actually, it has this other quality. It's something-esque, right? And that's why poi is different from other forms of Japanese grammar, like mitai, which we're going to look at next week. Mitai describes the qualities that seem to be in something, while using poi describes the distinction between how something is versus how it seems to be at a surface level. There has to be some kind of distinction when using poi, where you look at something and you go, I think I know what that thing is, but however, it exhibits some other quality of being like this other thing. Now, the thing is, when we use poi with a verb, the meaning is actually a little bit different. First, it's very important to know that poi cannot be used with all different types of verbs. It's actually quite limited to verbs that are kind of emblematic of qualities that people might have. Two very common examples are wasureru, to forget, and okoru, to get mad. Let's look at an example. 不公平なことを見るときに怒りっぽい. So, 不公平 means unfair, and therefore, 不公平なこと is an injustice, an unfair act. 見るときに means basically when one sees. So, 不公平なことを見るときに when I see an injustice. ね? And then 怒る is the verb to be angry. But here, 怒りっぽい means basically to be quick to anger, exhibiting the quality of angry. Remember, you can always think of poi as basically filled with some quality. In the case of a noun, it's some noun is filled with the quality of some other noun. In the case of one of the rare verbs like okoru that work really well with poi, it's something like filled with the quality of becoming angry. That's why poi doesn't work with all verbs, because you probably would never really have the occasion to use a verb like oyogu, to swim, with poi. Oyogi poi would end up meaning something like filled with the quality of being quick to go swimming, and that doesn't make sense, and you'd much more likely find like easier ways of saying something similar, like I really like going swimming, or I really enjoy going swimming, or gosh, I just love swimming and I'm happy to do it at any time. But really, poi doesn't exactly fill that, because you're not really creating a situation where you're looking at one thing and going, aha, I expect this kind of person to be this kind of person, and then going, but actually, they sure do love swimming. That doesn't quite work, if you understand what I'm saying, right? So, yeah. Anyway, another common verb that we're going to use a lot with poi is wasureru. This is the verb meaning to forget. So, let's look at an example of this, okay? So, あまりよく眠らないと忘れっぽくなる. あまりよく眠らないと忘れっぽくなる. Basically, when my sleeping is poor, I start to get forgetful. Note here that I've conjugated poi as ぽくなる. Poi, I'm sure you've picked up on by now, is itself an e adjective. When we use poi as a suffix, it's creating an adjectival form that describes the noun, the same way that we use any other adjective to describe a noun, or another adjective, or a verb, right? So I want you to compare these two idiomatic sentences. ラーメンは安いです. ラーメンは安くなる. These mean ramen is cheap, and ramen is becoming cheap. Meanwhile, with poi, we could use a sentence like ramen wa kokyū poi desu. That means ramen feels like a luxury. Or we could have a sentence like ramen wa kokyū poku naru, meaning ramen is starting to feel like a luxury. It's becoming that way, right? I think that kind of makes sense, okay? So that's all to say that poi is an adjective and thereby is subject to all of the typical functions of an e adjective. It conjugates like an e adjective. And since we know that Japanese will have conjugation for adjectives, poi is going to act in that same way. So, in the case of this sentence, amari yoku nemuranai to wasureppoku naru, we're seeing that when I don't sleep well, I become filled with the quality of forgetting. I become forgetful. The important note here is that when poi is used with a verb, it's not really creating an environment of contradiction the way we frequently use in the cases of nouns and adjectives. Instead, when used with verbs, this poi suffix really kind of creates an environment where the situation A often occurs, and as a result, the verb also often occurs. So something happens, and that causes the verb to also happen. Okay? So, well, that's all for me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about poi. Next week, we'll talk about mitai ne. Alright, I'll see you next week. Mata ne!